I want to welcome all of you to tonight's dinner conversation on the 2014 campaign, both here in California and across the country. For those of you who I haven't met in the past, my name is Dan Schnurr, and I'm the Executive Director of the Unruh Institute of Politics here at USC. And we're really, really excited by the group of panelists we have here to lead us in tonight's discussion. And we're really, really thrilled that so many of you, both students and off-campus guests, were able to join us to participate in the conversation. So what we'll do over the course of the next hour plus is my co-moderator and I will lead our panelists through a couple rounds of questioning. But then we want to make sure that there's time for questions from as many of you as possible too, and in particular the students, but our off-campus guests as well can ask questions if they like. But either way, we're looking forward to a conversation both on state and national politics. For those of you who haven't been here before, who haven't been to our events before, let me just tell you a little bit about the way we run these programs here at the Unruh Institute. First of all, we have an absolute rule when it comes to Unruh Institute programming, and that rule is we won't do any programs at any level in any way unless it includes students, not just as audience members, but as panelists and participants. And what we found over the years is that while we're always grateful for the insights and the expertise of our off-campus guests, that the contributions of our students are just as valuable. And so we're very eager to have both off-campus guests and students participating in tonight's discussion. Let me take a minute and introduce our panelists and my co-moderator, and then we'll get started. Sitting at the far end of the table is our friend Ace Smith. Ace is the senior partner at SCN Strategies, where he serves as a political advisor to Governor Jerry Brown. Okay, well, I'll keep going until the microphone's ready. The main qualification in an executive director for the Unruh Institute is someone who can talk long enough and loud enough to not need a microphone. All my students are thinking, okay, that's how he got the job now. Okay. But let me take a minute and introduce our guests. Ace Smith is a senior partner at SCN Strategies. He was the senior advisor to Governor Brown's successful re-election campaign, and time does not permit us tonight to run through the other successful campaigns he's advised, both in this election cycle and previously. But he's known and respected as one of the foremost political strategists in California and across the country. Ace Smith, thanks so much for being here with us. Sitting right here in the middle is another friend of ours, another off-campus guest. Aaron McClear is a partner at Redwood Pacific Public Affairs, and he was the senior advisor to the Neel Kashkari for governor campaign in this past election. Aaron also served as press secretary and chief media spokesman for Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and has advised a wide range of candidates and ballot initiatives since he moved to California some years ago. Also one of the most respected strategists among Republicans in both the state and the country. There we go. We are very, very happy to have Aaron McClear. Aaron, thanks so much for joining us. And then, as always, we're particularly pleased and particularly proud to have two student panelists. Sam Dorn is a member of the USC College Democrats. Tara Campbell is a member of the USC College Republicans. Both are enrolled in political science 439 this semester and have a major assignment due in the not too distant future. And they think they're going to get easy grading because they're participating in it. Sorry to disappoint you guys, but we're thrilled to have you here anyway. Let's give Tara and Sam a warm welcome. We also co-sponsor most of our programs over the course of a semester, not only with the College Democrats and the College Republicans, but our friends at the Daily Trojan. And for all of our programs, either Kirsten Olson, our director, where's Kirsten? By the way, thank Kirsten because she's the one who really makes it. Either Kirsten and I have the privilege of co-moderating our programs with one of the editors of the Daily Trojan. And tonight we are particularly pleased to have the editor-in-chief of the DT, Unruh Lee. Unruh, thank you so much for being here. And so with that, let's get the conversation started. Unruh, the question goes to you.
All right, well, this question is for Mr. Smith first. What do you think was the most important thing to know in the 2014 gubernatorial race?
Well, I think probably the most notable thing about the 2014 race was that it's the second straight election in which the Democrats have swept all the statewide offices. And I would argue that it's not just a function of having better candidates, having a better issue terrain. I would argue that it actually augurs something much more significant that you're going to see roll across the country, which is the increasing power and voice of the independent voters, who are truly the balance of power in California elections. And I think they've tipped the scales twice in a row for Democrats all the way across. And I think that's something you're going to see increasingly. And it's a longer discussion for another day, but it's a new demographic underpinning. It's younger voters. It's folks who aren't affiliating with parties, and they tend to be more fiscally conservative than traditional Democrats, but a lot more socially liberal or moderate than Republicans. And Democrats in California, I think across the nation increasingly are going to win that vote.
Ace, I want to talk more a little bit later about independent voters, because as some of you know, I have a particular interest in the subject. But before we get to that, I want to zero in, and before we talk more broadly, I want to talk specifically about the governor's race and about Governor Brown. He's now been elected to his fourth term as governor of California, an unprecedented accomplishment. Talk a little bit about the unique path that brought him here and allowed him to win re-election by such a convincing margin.
Well, maybe the other thing that was, I think, largely, maybe not necessarily unappreciated, but certainly unnoticed, was that he ran, and not surprising considering who he is, ran a very unconventional campaign. And and I think there was some tension between the press corps and our campaign and the pundits, because I think everyone still has the notion of campaigns of being, I'm exaggerating here, but the county fairs and the straw hats and the buttons and the debates and the press conferences and all this sort of stuff. And campaigns are changing, and they've changed. And think about his campaign. His campaign was kind of a unique thing. Now, there are circumstances very different, but what's unique about it is here's a person who spent his campaign not talking about himself, not talking about his accomplishments, but actually talking about the voters and to the voters about something that he wanted them to join in and do with him. And that's a radically different type of campaign than anything you might have seen. So I know we took some criticism, and a lot of it was along the lines of, oh my goodness, he's not campaigning, but he was campaigning, and he was campaigning, as hard as anyone, but he was just doing it differently.
I'm going to ask one more follow-up of the Ace before we take this conversation to Aaron and the rest of the panel. You talked a moment ago about independent voters, and again, the broader conversation is one we'll come back to. But I want to talk about it particularly as it relates to Governor Brown. Because here you have a governor who is a lifelong committed Democrat, but who fought very fiercely to restrain spending in the state budget, who did not agree with many members of his own party to ban fracking in California, and has taken a number of other positions that deviate from Democratic orthodoxy. Again, he clearly is a Democrat, that's who he is. But talk a little bit about how a governor or a candidate for governor reaches out to those independents outside of party orthodoxy without alienating or disappointing the party base.
I think that it's just very simple. And look, it's a little probably unfair to put that burden on it. Not everyone could pull off what Jerry Brown could pull off because of who he is in his history and having been a presidential campaign candidate and a national figure. So it's easier said than actually done. But I also think it shows the future, which is that voters are wanting nothing more than independent, smart voices who are looking out for them and for their interests, in a way that isn't the old style politics. And to some degree or another, that's been the story of his entire career. As he, he's in his last term as governor, and so, that's probably a little bit of a liberating thing, and kind of unshackles a lot of those things that younger politicians might have to worry about and think about.
All right, well, this question is for Mr. McClear. So what do you think was the most important thing to know in the Neil Kashkari campaign?
Well, I think, Ace and I were talking a little bit earlier, we both had candidates and were running campaigns that I think were quite different than what you've seen before, and a lot of that was because, from the get-go it was a 20-point spread and ended up being about a 20-point spread. And so out of necessity, it's going to be a different kind of campaign. What we were pretty proud of with Neil is that he knew that winning the governorship was going to be a long shot. And so what he wanted to do was try to accomplish something else, which was get people thinking differently about Republicans. Right now, Republicans really don't have a seat at the table in California with making decisions. That they're really not part of the conversation. And I think I don't consider myself a partisan person at all, but I think it's important to have a viable two-party system in California, which we really don't have right now. So that was the thing he was trying to accomplish, was to get people to think differently about Republicans. So we have that two-party system here. I think we're able to move the needle on that. I've heard from a lot of candidates who were thankful that he was at the top of the ticket, that the things he was focusing on were very helpful, and his outreach, to groups that frankly Republicans have been ignoring for a long time. Was a really big part of this. And I hope that while we knew it was going to be a long shot to ultimately be successful in beating the governor, I hope that he was able to allow the next candidate to kind of follow in that mold.
Well, it's commonly believed, Aaron, that the Republicans' greatest difficulty in California is an unacceptably conservative agenda on social and cultural issues. Now, Kashkari ran as a pro-immigration reform, pro-choice, pro-same-sex marriage Republican. Do you believe that is a successful template for Republicans going forward? Or are you concerned that more traditional conservative Republicans are going to look at the outcome of the race and say, well, we tried it that way, it didn't work. Let's go back to a more traditional conservative message?
I don't think that that's going to happen, and here's why. Neil won the primary against a Tea Party candidate who was really the embodiment, the caricature of what people's perception, the negative perception that people have of Republicans. It just would have been horrible. It would have set us back another generation, I think, if he would have been at the top of the ticket carrying the flag for Republicans. So I think what Neil was able to do was he didn't run to the right at any point. I was a little frustrated with the gentleman who won the Secretary of State's race, Dan, against you, who ran as a proud Republican during the primary and then ran as a fierce independent afterward. It's not exactly a profile in courage. Neil was always going to be who he was throughout, and he said from the get-go, look, if the primary voters don't like it, no big deal. Famously, he was at Sac State, was asked about the Second Amendment, and he basically said, look, I just don't think that you should have the tank. I don't think that's what the Second Amendment means. If you don't like it, don't vote for me. And that was kind of his attitude during the primary. Here's who I am. And so the base was actually, once he won the primary, he went to the convention and talked to the base about how the Republican Party is the party of civil rights, the party of income inequality, the party who should be fighting for poverty. Those were some of the issues he was running on. So and they accepted that, and they gave him a standing ovation for that. He didn't go there and deliver a red meat speech. And so I think that he was able to actually keep the base while not running toward them. And I think that's going to be an important lesson for people in the future to see that, unlike 4 years ago when you had a Republican primary, they're trying to outflank each other on the right on immigration. I think they've seen a successful candidate who can win the primary as more of a moderate, but also keep the base. And hopefully the next candidate's not going to have to think they need to run to the right.
Well, thank you, Aaron. And speaking of the future, speaking of what comes next, Tara Campbell, you worked on a couple of campaigns this past cycle. And while, as Ace correctly pointed out, the Democrats for the second cycle in a row swept the statewide races, there were some rays of hope for Republicans, and you were at ground zero for at least some of those rays of hope. Maybe you can pick up a little bit where Aaron left off about what the Republican Party needs to do going forward in order to reach out to a broader range of voters, based on your experience this year.
Yeah, I worked on Ling Ling Chang, who ran for state assembly, and I worked on Mimi Walters' campaign, who was running for Congress. There are still some safe Republican seats in the state, but there was a big wave of women candidates and Asian American women candidates, 4 of which won, 2 of which outseated Democrat incumbents. So there were some definite wins for Republicans in the state legislature. I know that it was more of a primary battle for the ones that I was on, but they were out helping other candidates throughout the state, and they were picking up seats. And I think that you were mentioning earlier that Jim Brulty who is the chair of the California Republican Party, is trying to focus on those local seats so that we can get a more two-party system in California and go from there.
Okay, just to follow up, now as far as Kashkari, how effective were his social media tactics in attracting younger Republican voters?
I think Neil Kashkari was great at the social media. I know he was tweeting himself, we mentioned that, but he went out to the streets, he was a homeless person for a day, he did those for a week, and did those kind of outlandish tactics that I think brought more earned media to him. I know that he also did a scholarship for students where if you created a campaign ad, you got like a $10,000 scholarship. I thought those were great ideas to engage the younger generation, especially college students. We all need money to go here. So I think those were tactics that other Republican candidates can use going forward to get earned media and engage those younger generations.
If I could just pick up on that really quickly, I mean, one thing that we really liked about Neil, which I think was effective that you didn't see with Meg Whitman or with Governor Romney, was this authenticity. You know, love him or hate him, I think that you got a sense of exactly who he was and what he was about. And tweeting himself and having his Instagram account, we didn't do as much on Facebook, but having that direct access, people were asking him questions, reporters were asking him questions, drove me nuts, because I was out of the loop. We saw what he tweeted when he did. But I think that adds to the authenticity that I think it's so important for a candidate, for people to see that they're not a puppet, but they're a real person. So I think it was obviously we didn't win, but I think it was an effective tactic for us that he wanted to do, just to have him be directly interacting with voters on Twitter.
Okay. Sam, we want to bring you into this conversation. And you were also active in the election cycle this year, both back in Virginia and here in Los Angeles. And one of the things I've heard you talk about, which I think is particularly interesting, is that because the top of the ticket was such a large margin, that had all sorts of unexpected impacts down ticket. Now, you were involved in the LA County Supervisor's race on behalf of Bobby Shriver and his campaign against Sheila Kuehl. Talk a little bit about how that large margin at the top of the ticket has an impact on even on a local or a county race.
Well, I actually worked there in the primary and then came back for the general, and I think if you were there for the primary, there was a lot of energy. There was a lot of, because there was so many people competing for the seat, I think at the end we had 9 people vying for that seat, of which there was 4 main contenders, Sheila Kuehl, who ended up winning, Bobby Shriver, John Duran, and Pamela Ulick, who was the mayor of Malibu. There was a drive, a really need to get out there, and every vote really made a lot more of a difference. In the general election, which we just had, and this goes to your point, Dan, about having the contest between Governor Brown and Neil Kashkari not being so competitive, there wasn't so much incentive for people to come out, which hurt my campaign because one thing we, as the moderate candidate, which some people have later labeled us the chamber candidate since both were Democrats, is that we didn't get the Republicans we needed to tip us over the edge. If we had had the Republicans, if the Republicans had come out to vote for Neil Kashkari and they lived in the 3rd district, they were going to vote for us. Sheila Kuehl, whatever you think of her, has an extremely liberal record, whether that's good or bad, everyone's personal opinion. It was highly unlikely they were going to vote for her. So we would have had those votes because the election was not as competitive as it might have been if we were in a different state, and if Jerry Brown, who has his long legacy, was not running, we might have gotten a lot more of those votes, and that might have been enough to push us over the edge.
Well, I want to make sure I understand this, because if I do, it's a really fascinating point, which is the difficulties that Republicans had in statewide races not only harmed a lot of Republicans down ticket, but it harms some more moderate and centrist Democrats. Is that what you're saying?
That is, and I really do think it's a shame, personally. Not just because I work for him, but
But especially so.
yeah, especially.
Okay. I want to come back to you in just a minute to talk national politics, Sam, but I want to get back first to a point that Ace was making earlier about the importance of independent voters. One of the, and what I've heard you talk about before, Ace, is lessons from California for the national political leadership in both parties. And that is the growing emergence and growing influence of independents. Looking forward, we'll talk a little bit later about whether you think there's any possibility, for example, that Hillary Clinton might run for president. We can come back to that a little bit later.
He's going to run the campaign.
But look at him smiling, I guess he is. But if I can ask you to put on your forecaster's hat, talk a little bit about what you've seen here in terms of in California, in terms of the growth of independent voters, and what that bodes nationally as we look forward.
Sure. And I think you have to step back when you talk about this subject, because it's not just a lot of times when you look at political data and it looks kind of, really kind of dry and not much life to it. But there are things that you look at that are changing. They're not just numbers in a column, but they're actually kind of transforming how things work underneath. And I think this is one of those things. And stated as simply as possible, I think it kind of goes like this, and I'm oversimplifying it, but there was, I know my generation, certainly my parents' generation, previous generations, being a member of a party, Democrat or Republican, was largely a way you kind of place yourself on the social tapestry as you came of age. And it was an important, it was something important, signifying who you are, who you stood with, what groups you stood with, where you lived, a lot of things. I think young people growing up today find, not all, but much larger than previous generations, just absolutely no, they don't feel the need to do that, to affiliate. And so if you look at who independent voters are, the striking thing is, okay, so where are the most independent voters in California, for instance, or the largest percentage are in San Francisco, California, over 30%. Go around the Bay Area counties. They tend to be young, urban, pretty darn liberal voters, actually, on social issues, but a little more conservative, actually, on fiscal, and actually kind of more libertarian on fiscal issues. Conservative is not really the right word. So how does that transform things? It transforms things in the following ways. They tend to be a little more unaffiliated than party voters, and so that, like, they don't, for instance, they don't do a very good job voting in primaries. They do a good job voting in general elections, tend to be the balance. But more than anything, they're not persuaded by these kind of the old political arguments of, here's my platform, here's what I'm going to do for you. They're actually much more interested in seeing how the whole thing's going to work together and move forward. So it's not so much the old cut and dry, you're right on this issue, you're right on this issue, you're right on this issue, and tally it all up, and that's what I'm going to vote for. It's a much more, a much more look towards the future and look towards, where's the economy going to be for me, who's actually producing jobs, who can I actually trust, who do I believe, and I think it's a lot of, not as much about the old politics. And I think that's going to, I really think it's going to transform things, and Jerry Brown is the perfect candidate for those voters.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on your point about the generational shift. I mean, you and I grew up with 3 stations on our television set, 5 buttons on our car radio, and 2 political parties. For a generation with an infinite number of entertainment and information options, 2 parties does seem, binary choice between 2 parties does seem somewhat archaic. Now, Aaron, let me come to you with a related question that relates a little bit more to this year's elections. You've spent a lot of time thinking about why Republicans did so much better nationally, in the Senate races in particular, this year than they did in the last couple of cycles. And while you're not talking specifically about independent voters, you are talking about candidates who are more successful at appealing to those voters. Maybe you can talk about what you saw this year nationally that wasn't there 2 years ago or 4 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, it's not unlike what Kashkari was. I mean, on paper, he's exactly what Ace just said. He's socially libertarian and fiscally conservative, and that's he really tracks with the electorate in California. And in the same way, nationally, for the first time, and I'm really glad we did this, I was talking to Stephen Law last night with American Crossroads, which is Karl Rove's IE. And what they did was they went into the primaries for the first time this year and actually made sure that we picked candidates who were in line with the electorate, candidates that could win. That's not necessarily the most conservative candidate, but the most conservative candidate that had a chance of winning. You guys recall a couple years ago when we had Sharon Angle, we had Christine O'Donnell, and we had some really, I'm not going to say lousy candidates, but candidates that had no shot of winning because they didn't reflect, the electorate that they were trying to win. So I think that was a big shift this year. The most interesting thing to me nationally, frankly, this year was Republicans going into primaries and picking the people with the best shot, and they were successful by and large.
And I think the people, if I could just follow up on that in terms of independent voters, the people who are the most successful this year that I saw, Kashkari, even though he didn't win in terms of appealing to them, and Ed Gillespie in Virginia, which is the angle I come at it from, did it because they managed not only to recognize the fact that there were more independent voters, but really engage them. And if you look at, by comparison, in terms particularly for Kashkari, in my home county, Rob Astorino, the county executive running for governor of New York, ran a very traditional, I would call it slash and burn campaign more than anything else, where his goal was to tear down Governor Cuomo, and he was going to do everything possible in his power to get Governor Cuomo. That was it. He didn't do anything innovative. He didn't really try and reach out. Nothing new, nothing exciting, and the young voters did not respond to him. Neil Kashkari did try new things. It wasn't enough to tip you over the edge, unfortunately, but it did bring more people to your cause.
And for Tara, so what is this new Republican Party looking like as far as you mentioned earlier we talked about the demographics of the spread. What do you think as far as GOP and how it's spreading out demographically?
No, definitely nationally, the Republican face is changing. We saw Republicans picked up 3 female senators. Mia Love's the first female black congresswoman that is Republican. We have the first black senator from the South since Reconstruction in Tim Scott. We have a lot of different faces. We're not only, Republicans are no longer the party of old white men, and so I think race is going to stop playing such a big role in politics, slowly but surely. It's not going to be so race driven, and I think that's the change you're going to see now.
Sam, why don't you give your thoughts on that? Do you see Republicans having the potential to make inroads with minority voters, or do you still see that as being a fairly secure part of the Democratic base going forward?
I think, well, first of all, there's always potential, and I don't think that we should ever just shut off any party. And it's dangerous for Democrats to just continuously assume that Republicans are going to keep losing these racial demographics. That's a terrible strategy for Democrats to pursue. I think one person who's been particularly influential on the Republican side in reaching out is Rand Paul, and that's why I'm keeping my eye on him for 2016, just because he's gone out not only to Ferguson, Missouri, and when all of the violence and such happened there, he went out and really talked to them and got involved, but he's been going to San Francisco. Who would have imagined a potential Republican presidential nominee going to San Francisco and lobbying the tech communities there for their votes and their ideas on modernizing government? It's totally out of the blue. So I think that there's definitely hope for your party, Tara, but for right now, I'll gladly keep that advantage in our column.
Well, Ace, we managed to wait 31 and a half minutes before bringing up the subject of the 2016 presidential election. Since we're here, though, you talked about the ongoing and increasing importance of independent voters. But as we begin to shift our focus from 2014, both here in California and nationally, to the next presidential election, what should we keep top of mind as we watch the field in both parties come together?
Well, I think there's only one person to watch in one party, and there's a lot of people in the other.
Go on.
Well, your party's very interesting.
His former party, he's no.
Yeah, okay. I'd love to hear what Aaron has to say about it, but I think that the Republican Party nomination is going to be a Donnybrook and interesting to watch, and I think it will really be about the future of the party.
It's going to be more interesting this year. I mean, the last time around, and I was a big fan of Governor Romney, but he was really the only A-lister we had running. And we talked about how Neil's opponent in the primary was the caricature of the most negative perceptions of Republicans. I mean, that was pretty much, it was a clown show. I mean, you look at the dais, the 9 candidates, and it was just like, oh, that's that caricature, that's that caricature. I mean, it was just like, it was so bad. This is gonna be different. I think we have a lot of all-stars running. And so there's a dozen potential candidates that would have been on par with Governor Romney last time around. So that's gonna be interesting. And it's obviously an open seat, which makes it much more interesting. We can guess on the horse race at this point, but there's so much time between now and the caucuses that who knows. But I guarantee we'll have a lot better candidates this time around for sure.
It's only 730 days. Come on, it's not counting down.
I guess not.
Tara, who are you watching out of those dozen or more candidates?
I'm watching Jeb Bush, Rand Paul, Chris Christie. I think those are 3 of the strongest candidates we got going, but it'll be interesting to see if it's a situation like 2012 where Romney just got beaten down so hard in that primary, battling out with all those other caricatures, that it might be a race to who's more conservative. And I'm afraid that they're going to have to veer back to run against Hillary or whoever it is. That it's gonna be bad. There's going to be a huge dais of all-stars, and I'm afraid that one of them is going to run to the far right.
I think that's a really good point, though. I think if Senator Clinton chooses to run and chooses Ace to run the campaign, as I read in Politico, that it's she's got she'll clear the field and she won't have to get beat up. And I think that's a very good point. That what we saw a couple years ago, that was not helpful for any of the Republicans to get beat up for months. Do up to 1,000 debates. So you're right.
Ace, before we go on with the discussion, if you'd like to give the Daily Trojan a scoop about your plans for 2016. Sam, I know we talked in class a lot about Secretary Clinton and her prospects going forward. What are your thoughts?
In terms of do I want her or what do I think her ability will be to get the nomination?
Let's go with her ability to get the nomination and to get elected, since you can give Ace your resume after the panel.
Okay. Well, your class has prepared me well, so. I think that, like Ace said, if she decides to run, which I think she is leaning towards, she's going to clear the field. I shouldn't say that. I think Governor O'Malley is going to run regardless because he's out of a job at the end of this year and might as well try for a new one. I think there's a high likelihood Senator Sanders is going to run because he doesn't think there's enough of a liberal voice in the discussion right now. I actually am leaning towards thinking that Jim Webb, the former senator from Virginia, will run for the opposite reason of Bernie Sanders. He doesn't think there's enough of a conservative Democrat running. So we're going to have an interesting thing there. I don't think Joe Biden is going to run, unfortunately. I would have loved to have President Biden.
So we'd love for him.
Yeah.
We'd love for Biden to be in there.
But I think if she runs, she gets the nomination. I am a little nervous about the general election. I think that generationally she represents a step back in the fact that she is a little older than many of our traditional candidates. And that's kind of an interesting thing about this election is that if Rand Paul or Marco Rubio gets nominated and they're running against Hillary, the Democrats are going to be the party of the old, the second choice of the last cycle, whereas the Republicans are going to have not the next in line, the fresh new face. So it'll be an interesting inversion.
And how'd that work out for the Republicans in 1980?
Ace, I'm going to ask you to answer a question rather than ask them. We need to go over the rules of this panel again. I'm not going to ask, I'm not going to try to put you on the spot. I think everyone's career choices are their own business until they choose to announce them. So you have another 30 minutes or so before we're ready for an announcement. All joking aside, one of Secretary Clinton's greatest strengths, aside from the historic nature of her campaign should she be elected, one of her greatest strengths is, of course, her very considerable experience. Now, as Sam noted a moment ago, experience is a huge positive for a candidate. On the other hand, in national politics, long-time familiarity, the amount of time that she has spent on the national stage, is something that could at least potentially work against her. I'm wondering if you can talk about how those two play off of each other, either for the secretary or more broadly.
Well, I actually think there's kind of a good test case for this, which was the election that Meg Whitman ran against Jerry Brown 4 years ago. Where essentially she tried to make the case about generational thing, and actually tried to make all sorts of arguments about, actually rather obscure arguments about the time when he had, that spanned decades. I think people look into the future, and I think it'll fall as flat as that campaign fell.
So clearly there's other factors in play to her agenda as the issue she emphasizes and so on looking forward. But just to be clear, you see that breadth and length of experience as a considerable net plus.
It's a huge net plus, and I think the central question will be, who can keep the economic recovery going and broaden it to really kind of make the economy work for all working Americans.
Aaron, your thoughts on the same question?
About whether or not her age and experience could work against her. I mean, I think that Ace makes a couple good analogies with President Reagan and Governor Brown, being able to do that. I just think that there's a lot of baggage. She's very toxic. The good thing is, people already have an opinion about her, and so there's, I think that it would be tough to kind of shake that. I mean, it's a good thing for us. I think it's going to be tough to kind of rebrand or repackage that in any way. She'd be a strong candidate. She'll raise a ton of money, and she certainly has a base. I think what Sam says is kind of interesting, though, that it's kind of flipped, where you have the known quantity that we kind of making people kind of sick of it, and then fresh face and maybe an interesting direction with Republicans. So it could be an interesting dynamic.
All right, so shifting from candidates and talk strategy to actual campaign strategy. With the advent of social media technology and the speed of information travel changing, voters have been inundated with information regarding candidates and policy measures. So how does the existence of such quick information dispersal affect campaign strategy? I guess I could start with Mr. McClure.
Well, I think to my earlier point, I think it was great for Neil because he had the personality and the discipline to be able to tweet himself, which I thought was pretty cool. And I think it was a bit unique. You see candidates doing a bit more. You have to have the right candidate to do that. I mean, it was pretty scary, initially when he started doing that because it's just totally unfiltered. We didn't know what he was going to say. I'm sitting there, kind of monitoring Twitter, and he's talking to the Times reporters or something. Like, dude, you got to give me a call. But he's smart. He's disciplined. Everything he was saying was fine. But I think it's certainly again when it comes to authenticity, which is so important for candidates, and you either have it or you don't. If you have a candidate who's able to do that, I think that it really, really helps with that authenticity, which makes it much more attractive.
And for follow-up for Mr. Smith, so yeah, the same thing about social media. Does this quick information travel affect your strategy at all, or is it an extra tool? Or
Tremendously. I think there's two things worth noting, and anyone who tells you they know the answer is a liar, but it's where it's moving, and I don't think anyone solved it, but I mean, the first fundamental shift is that with newspapers, essentially really just becoming more and more irrelevant. News is, so that in previous generations really created a pyramid, a news pyramid that was, the bottom of which and the widest part was local news and state news. And then national and international news were kind of like the top and the smallest parts. And I actually think the world we live in, instantaneous news and how we consume it, actually I think the pyramid is flipped. And I think folks have a lot more national and international news and then actually kind of local and state. And so it actually creates, in a governor's race, a tremendous advantage for an incumbent because you actually kind of have, to some degree or another, have the means of production. You own them since you get covered doing what you're doing, and it's very hard to get people's focus on state and local stuff anymore. But the other thing that's just revolutionary is I think that people are not consuming news in the set ways they used to consume them with either the major national networks or newspapers. It's all being shared. And so what may be the most important news source in the next presidential campaign? I mean, it may be BuzzFeed. But it's the social sharing of news that's changed and how people consume it, and that's going to radically change it all. Let
me ask you a follow-up, not so much about online media and social media, but the broader question about news coverage. It appeared to me watching the past several months that Governor Brown, while certainly like any governor, attracts a certain amount of news attention simply because of the official acts he takes as governor. He seemed to devote until the very last few weeks of the campaign much less effort, much less travel in order to attract traditional news coverage that his predecessors had. Schwarzenegger, Davis, Wilson, even when running for re-election, he spent a lot of time scurrying around the state, hoping to get on television, trying to get some media attention. It seemed like less than an imperative for the governor in this re-election campaign. Is that just simply a function of the spread, or does it reflect what you were just talking about, a different way that news consumers access news and information?
I think it reflects a different way. And I think that it wasn't just in his case the mechanism, it was also the message. And so having a radically different message, it wasn't about him and his record, but rather about the voters and the needs of California, and then actually really kind of directly talking to them, rather than running around with brass bands and straw hats.
Yeah, I think too. I mean, the governor's kind of behaved that way for 4 years, and it's been incredibly successful. I mean, Ace mentioned that the press gets frustrated because they have a hard time getting answers out of that office and getting calls returned, and he's not out there doing interviews a lot. But I tell you what, it's working because I work for the guy who did the opposite approach. We were out there doing events all day, every day, several times a day.
This is Governor Schwarzenegger.
Governor Schwarzenegger, correct. And, I walked in that office at 63% approval and I walked out about 30. So, I think that people were ready after seeing all the events and the bluster and everything. I thought it was really smart. It has been really smart, Governor Brown, to have kind of the opposite approach, which is just nose to the grindstone, getting the job done. And, the Governor Schwarzenegger said something interesting to me a couple years ago when we were talking about this dynamic, which is that, people generally don't like their elected officials. They don't like state government, particularly when we were there, we were dealing with, budgets that weren't balanced and deficits and everything. And he's like, every night people saw me on TV and they just hated that. They just hated that's government. I don't like government. Arnold is a reminder of government every night. And you don't see Governor Brown on TV. And I think that was Governor Schwarzenegger's take on it, which I think was pretty interesting, was that being in the background, just nose to the grindstone, getting the job done is actually much more effective than what we were trying to do, which was to try to steer that coverage all the time.
It's an interesting microcosm too, because if you look at Mayor Villaraigosa and Mayor Garcetti now, they're playing out the same drama going on after Mayor Villaraigosa did, all the parties at Hancock Park and everything else and his messy divorce. Now you have Mayor Garcetti, who people haven't seen head or tail of in a long time. He goes out, he does official events, but really, if you're not looking for him, you're not going to see him.
Let's do this. I think we've monopolized this conversation long enough, don't you? Let's open it up to a broader conversation with questions from all of you. But before we do, there's something I meant to do at the beginning of the program that I neglected to, and I apologize. I made a point, as I intended to, of letting the students here know how much we appreciate you taking time away from your busy schedules to participate. And I mentioned more broadly our off-campus guests and how much we appreciate you being here. But in particular, many of our off-campus guests are here not only because of their interest in politics and their just completed campaign, but because of their ongoing involvement in our Unruh Institute events and activities. And in particular, I want to take a moment to thank the people here who have worked with us to provide internships for our young men and women, for our outstanding students. And I'd ask not only the students, but all of the guests to thank our internship providers for giving our students such an extraordinary first set of opportunities to experience politics and government. So thank you all very, very much for being here. I would have gotten in so much trouble if I had forgotten. Okay. All right, so we're going to open this up to questions. And for those of you who've come to our programs recently, you'll recognize this. For those of you who haven't been here in a little bit longer time period, you'll remember it. But two requests that we make of you, if you have a question, when you raise your hand and one of us calls on you, tell us who you are, so both of us and all of the panelists know who's participating in the conversation. And second, if you do have a question for somebody whose politics you may happen to disagree with, we ask that you frame that question with the same respect and regard that you'd hope they'd show for you. Someone who disagrees with you isn't your enemy. They're an equally smart, committed person to public service who just happens to have come to a different set of conclusions than you have. And so being able to talk to them with respect, even when you're coming at it from a different perspective, we always believe is one of the strengths of our program, and we hope it's something that you'll keep in mind. Got it, Lindsay? Okay. All right. Who may have questions for our panelists?
So I come from a state that has the opposite situation as California. I come from Kansas. The Republicans are the Democrats like in California. There's the majority party. The Democrats in Kansas this year focused a lot on data-driven solution to winning the gubernatorial campaign. And I know that the Obama campaign has done a great job in 2 elections with using data to win an election. So what role did data play in each of your elections in the California governor's race? And then also, how do you not only have that data and say, oh wow, we've got a great path to victory, but also get people to actually vote on election day and not just rely on the voter targeting that comes from having more data?
Boy, so the use of data both for voter targeting and for voter turnout. Anyone like to speak to it?
Well, I have a short answer. We didn't have the resources to have much of that effort.
But you have worked on campaigns that... Correct.
I mean, in this case, the party doesn't have a list, the party didn't have data, and you didn't have the resources to kind of develop something like that. But you're absolutely right. It's playing an even bigger part. The challenge right now is there's so much data and so many ways to slice and dice it. It's kind of harnessing it right now. Everybody's trying to figure out the best way to harness it. As far as getting people out on election day, what we're trying to do with that data is bank those votes with absentees as quickly as possible. So what we're trying to do is find those voters, find exactly how they're affected, and try to get them to vote as quickly as possible so we can mark them off the list and move on to the next voter. It's a lot of really smart people are trying to figure this out right now. And frankly, I think the Republicans generally about a cycle behind. When I did the Bush campaign in 2004, I think it was the opposite. We did micro-targeting, which was kind of was at the time seemed to be kind of a new thing. The Democrats caught up pretty quickly and surpassed us, and now it's up to us to do the same thing.
Ace, how does access to this extraordinary amount of data change the way you run a campaign, or does it?
Actually, I actually think it's valuable but vastly overrated. I had a math teacher in high school who used to always say, computers are the smartest dumb things that you'll ever experience in your life. I mean, ultimately, people are making the decisions. I mean, if you know, so I do think that there is a bad side, which in larger elections will all come to haunt you, which is you can't just slice and dice the universe and say different things to different people. And I think that's, I don't think that's good politics even. So and I think that's the road to temptation that leads you down, and I don't. I always believe that if you should have a meta message, and then you should have variations that drive your meta message and all works together. But but data leads you kind of the road of temptation of really saying, and you see it happening in a lot of local races where you see a lot of folks run campaigns where they're saying essentially different things to different people, and that's just bad all around.
And for students writing their poli-sci 439 papers, what you just heard Ace say is you don't change your message when you're talking to different audiences. You just change your emphasis in what you're talking about, but you don't contradict yourself. Who else has questions? Yes. Okay.
I'm Nathaniel. I'm a political science and economics major. I have a question particularly for Mr. Smith and Mr. Dorn. That's the last time you'll ever hear me say this.
It's on camera, so.
I think one of the big things the Democrats failed to do in this midterm cycle was encourage turnout, and particularly in a state like Colorado, where they lost Hickenlooper seat and they lost Udall seat, or Bennett seat. What do you think went wrong in the Democrats' sort of turnout operation, and how do you think they can correct that failure to encourage the young demographic that did so strongly for Obama in 08 and 12 to do the same in 2016?
So in Colorado, I'm sorry, from my understanding, Colorado, we won Hickenlooper's seat, and it was not Bennett, it was Udall that was up.
Did Hickenlooper won?
Yes, I can loop along.
Well, let me take Nathaniel's question and broaden it a little bit into a national question. Clearly, Democrats, Democrats struggled to turn out their base in the 6th year of an Obama presidency, much in the same way that Republicans struggled to turn out their base 8 years ago in the 6th year of a Bush presidency. But generally speaking, the most loyal Democratic voters tend to turn out in smaller numbers in off-year elections. And I'm wondering if you can talk to that challenge and what a party can do to overcome it.
Well, I think that turnout's tends to be the most misunderstood thing in elections, and because yes, mechanically you can drive some turnout, but mechanically you're never going to drive turnout in a way that's more than marginal. You know, maybe in a small electorate, you could maybe push it a few points. In a large electorate, maybe but it's a very and which could be the difference between victory and defeat. So you don't mechanically drive turnout 10, 20, 30 points. I mean, what drives turnout, of that magnitude is a persuasive message, persuasive candidates, some excitement. And as a matter of fact, I actually think one of the ironies about the governor's race and people talk about the black turnout is, to some degree or another, you also have to, I know it's politics, but human beings act like human beings. And when you have not as many people show up to a college football game, when USC plays, some D2 team, and it's going to be 55-10, right? That's not a compelling game to show up to. And so when you have basically a non-competitive, top of the ticket, non-competitive, people aren't going to show up for that. It's just there's not a contest.
Actually, we're perfectly happy to show up and watch a 55-10 game.
Okay, well, I speak as a Cal fan.
Yeah, so in this cycle, and particularly in Colorado, the problem I saw was that I think you have to understand, and everyone has to understand, that campaigning does not exist in a vacuum. Everything you do in your governing capacity directly impacts what you do in your campaign capacity. And I think Udall failed to build himself a brand that he could run on. That's one part of it. The second part of it, as you pointed out, Aaron, is selecting good candidates. Cory Gardner, incredible candidate. WAPO actually gave him the best candidate of the cycle and they managed to get Ken Buck out of the race and put Gardner in there, and Gardner really ran a good campaign. What Udall tried to do was paint him as a right-wing, fire-breathing extremist, and attacked him particularly on women's issues, such to the point where some people were calling him, instead of Mark Udall, Mark Uterus. That's not a good thing. He ended up getting painted with that brush, and that backfired on him. So I think in part it's good candidates, in part it's building a brand as a governing figure, which I think is Mark Bainish's downfall too. Even though he ran probably one of the better campaigns this cycle, I don't think he had enough to stand on from his record in Congress. So I think it's those two things that are really the big deal. And in terms of turnout, in particular, these were purple states, not everyone, but it's standing up and getting your message right. In all likelihood, should Martha Coakley have lost Massachusetts? Martha Chokley, they're calling her now? Probably not. Larry Hogan should not have won Maryland, but messages were not good.
We want to make sure that our guests have a chance to ask questions, but also want to make particularly sure that students who might want to weigh in on the conversation have an opportunity to. So I want to make sure to come to the guests in just a moment. I just want to make sure there aren't any student questions, and as a matter of fact, there are.
Hi, my name is Julia. I'm studying public relations, and I'm wondering if you can talk about this for anyone and everyone, minimum wage increases across the country and kind of what the future in the next couple of years of that is going to look like.
Well, you did a campaign in San Francisco, right?
Yeah, and we did.
And Hayes just ran that issue.
Yeah, and actually in my candidate in Oakland, Libby Schaff, remember that name, she'll write it down, future star. But and she ran on that as well. I think the larger issue is, and you'll note that it passed in a lot of states that didn't go the Democrats' way as well, in a lot of areas. And but I think if you want to describe, kind of like where the economic message is, it's kind of like you have a whole bunch of people in this country who are 40 and 50 years old, who are tenuous or feeling anxious about their jobs. Their wages have been relatively flat while they've seen this recovery that everyone's been talking about, and they're worried that if they lose their job, they're going to end up working at Walmart and lose most of their benefits. And a lot of them have kids who just graduate from college, who are carrying around debts the size of a New England farmer in the 19th century, and instead of having a decent job, they're sitting on the couch playing PlayStation. So it's the real question is, how do you actually take the economic recovery and broaden it and widen it and include all Americans? And I think that will be a huge issue.
And Aaron, maybe you can address this from your perspective also, because even though a lot of the voters who ACE is talking about aren't directly impacted by an increase in the minimum wage, it's something that strikes a chord with them in a way that it might not be under more economically secure circumstances.
I think that's right, and that's one thing, and it's dangerous when political hacks like Ace and I talk policy, so I won't get into the other side of the minimum wage argument from a policy perspective. But one thing that the former governor of Indiana said to, his name is escaping me right now.
Mike Pence.
Mike Pence said to Cash Kari, when Cash Kari was doing a lot of poverty and income inequality, people were saying, "What are you doing? These people don't vote. They do the voting Democratic." And he said, "That's right, but when I ran, people said it to me too, but people will vote for you because you're carrying the flag for them." And so it's first of all, if you believe in it, if you want to run on income inequality and poverty and solutions to that, it's the right thing to do. But it's also smart politically, because I think people see that, people recognize that there's a growing income inequality, particularly here in California, and I think they generally support someone trying to do something about it. Different opinions on what exactly to do about it, but I think it's really smart politics to address that, because it shows that, particularly for a Republican, people usually don't think that's coming from Republicans. So I think it's smart politics.
There's a question over here, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Angelica Pena. I'm here from Noleo Educational Fund. We're the National Association of Latino Elected Officials. My question is, what are the strategies that each party will take in really catering to the Latino vote looking into 2016? And do you think that this Republican Congress in the next few years will have strategies to make sure that they're not maybe pushing that Latino vote in one direction or the other?
Well, I can just quickly speak for Republicans here in California. I mean, the Latino vote is, and the demographics, they are where they are, and we were hurt, and Dan can speak to this probably more succinctly, about 20 years ago, when Governor Wilson supported Prop 187, and Latinos in California still say that is a generation later, something that's really keeps them from supporting Republicans. So we have a lot of work to do here as Republicans in California. There are some efforts to try to help that. Charles Munger Jr., who's a big donor to Republicans, is funding something called Grow Elect, which is an effort to try to recruit and elect Latino candidates for Republicans, and they're having great success at school boards and city councils and things like that. So really trying to build a bench that way. And again, I'm too close to the Neal campaign, so I keep using that as an example. But what he was doing was spending all of his time that he needed with Republicans and every incremental minute after that in those communities that we've been ignoring. And what he found was a lot of times they didn't care that he was Republican. They just were happy he showed up. Like, that's great, a politician's here showing up, and he's talking about the issues I care about. And so I think we as Republicans need to show up a lot more than we have been.
Go ahead,
I was
Karen.
gonna say, there's definitely an effort to recruit Latino voters to the Republican side. I've actually walked in different cities like Santa Ana and Anaheim and Orange County trying to recruit those voters, coming with Spanish-speaking high school students to their door. So there's definitely an effort. I mean, by 2050, Latinos will be over half of California. So it's definitely something Republicans need to work at.
Ace, let me ask you a question on this. It seems to me that unless Republicans engage much more on broader comprehensive immigration reform in Congress than they have in the past, there's little danger of the Latino and Latina vote switching sides. But there is a significant amount of unhappiness in Hispanic American communities at the president's hesitation to act on immigration reform. maybe you can talk a little bit about the balance that he's trying to achieve there, and your thoughts on it going forward.
Yeah, I'm not so sure we have very much insight on what the president's doing, but I think when those issues get debated out in the presidential election, it'll be clear to voters where everyone stands. And I think the interesting thing too is I think you're going to see a lot of the swing states in these presidential elections move from the center of the country to the southwest, and that's going to be directly as a result of the growth of Latino voters, and that's going to be a fascinating trend to watch over the years.
And I would just add, because I think it's a terrific question, that unless the Republican Congress does pass comprehensive reform that includes a pathway to citizenship, it's hard to imagine a scenario under which anything significant shifts in this area. It would be unfortunate if that were the case for political, but more importantly for policy and real world reasons. Jeff?
Hi, I'm Jess. I'm a political science major, and I just had a question that kind of touches on a couple earlier questions, which is why do you think that minimum wage increases passed, which is an arguably like more liberal policy, yet Democrats didn't win many elections? And do you think it's like the way Democratic candidates market themselves, or the way these propositions were marketed?
I mean, personally for me, I don't think the two are tied together all the time, and that in the sense that you might vote yes on the minimum wage, regardless of your demographic or age or whatever, and then you might go, and depending on what state you're in, you might say, this person has been an incumbent, as many of the Democrats were, who lost office, and right now I'm sick of Congress. I'm sick of the gridlock. I'm sick of what's going on, and they're not getting anything done, and it's time for a fresh face. And that might have been your reason to vote. You could have had another issue that is your signature issue. You could have had another issue that was your signature issue. And even if you run a flawless campaign, Kay Hagan in North Carolina ran a brilliant campaign and still got hammered and still ended up losing to Tom Tillis.
Ace, is this an issue with broader utility for Democratic candidates going forward?
Yeah, I think it's part of the larger issue, which is how do you take the economic recovery and widen its impact, broadly.
Oh, there were a couple of questions over here.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you all for being here this evening. I'm a resident in the community, working with the churches and some of the community development corporations in the area, and we strongly supported Prop 47 and went out and organized the community members around supporting Prop 47. I wanted to ask a question of you guys regarding the county supervisors, who are sometimes referred to as God, because they oversee a 37 or some crazy amount $1 billion budget. And in today's Los Angeles Times, there was a editorial that's entitled "Lame Duck Shenanigans." And on yesterday, during the recess of government and everything else being shut down, the County Board of Supervisors met and made some very important decisions in terms of different seats in government. And the question in this article was that should that not have been left to the incoming supervisors who are coming in 3 weeks? Why would you do a chief of executive officer and head of various departments and do it in a clandestine kind of way? So I just wanted to kind of get you guys' opinion on that and see if you thought the same way. By the way, I supported Sheila at the back end of the election, and I'm glad she did.
Well, so thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Aaron, Ace, I know you guys are visitors from Northern California. And Sam, I know you worked on the supervisor's race, and Tara, your attentions were elsewhere. But if any of you have followed this, 5 LA County supervisors, 2 about to leave office, and the two about to leave have been working with their colleagues to make some pretty high-profile and influential appointments that the Times and others think ought to be left to the new board. I don't know how much you've seen or heard on this, or if you have thoughts on it. Sam, it looks
I
like you've
mean,
been following.
I have a general thought on it, and it's not as specific to this, it's to the idea in general of the quote-unquote lame ducks making these decisions, and it's something we're seeing right now in the U.S. Congress as Mitch McConnell and Harry Reid are kind of negotiating over who they want passed through for nominations. They're taking up Keystone Pipeline tomorrow, what they should deal with. And the way I see it is that you were elected for whatever position they were elected for, if it's Senate, for 6 years. Not for 5.5 years, not for 5 years and however many days, it's for 6 years. And whether you lost your race, you still are the representative of your state at that time. And it's still important to me, and I think back to, and this is somewhat of a dramatic example, but when 9/11 happened, Rudy Giuliani, I think, had, like a month left in his term before the election, and you still need someone in charge. They're still there, and they've been elected to do that. So I think, I don't know how clandestine it was, I haven't seen that article, but I think it should have been more open if it was this clandestine, but they've been empowered by God in the case of the supervisors, but they've been empowered with the responsibilities of their position, and they have a responsibility to do what they think is best.
And I don't know anything about the supervisors, but Prop 47, I tell you, write that down. That's a huge change in policy around crime in America, and it's happening here in California first.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Nate, I'll come to you in just a second, but just to echo Ace's last point, I know we talked about this a little bit in class, guys. No offense to either Jerry Brown or Neil Kashkari or their advisors, but the most important thing in the long term that happened last Tuesday was California either reversing or beginning to reverse decades of increased, stronger and longer and more stringent sentencing for criminal activity. And whether that's the beginning of a similar trend in the other direction or an aberration, either way, in my mind, not just as it relates to national politics and governance, is going forward in California, critically important occurrence. Nate?
Thanks, Dan. My name is Nate Kaplan. I'm founder and executive director of C Political. We actually animate videos that are unbiased and easy to understand about ballot propositions, and that's what we did this season. I'm a proud Trojan, got my master's in public policy here in 2011, so fight on. But my question is towards Aaron right now. Earlier on in the conversation, you spoke very strongly about how we need Republicans in office in California to balance and bring fairness to the process, the legislative process. Since we're in the world of academia here where anything is possible, what about a strong third party? You know, why isn't that an option or anything anyone ever talks about? And is it something that maybe the increase in independent voters are trying to send a message that maybe a strong, viable third party might actually be that balance versus the two parties?
I think the balance, and my wife is also a grad, so fight on. Dan, if you could vouch for me, I did this.
Yeah, I saw it.
Okay, good. I think the balance is the important thing, whether it's I mean, again, I've never really considered myself a partisan or an ideologue at all. So, in my view, it's just the balance is important. Right now, we have a governor who while I disagree with, you know, by and large, I think he's doing a perfectly fine job. And if we have the next governor come in, who is perhaps more in line with what the legislature would like him to do, that's a bigger problem. You know, right now, I think the people I represent, the business community and right of center folks, aren't terribly unhappy with the way things are because we have a governor who is less than horrible. I think I should that sounds to me. I don't mean less than horrible. I mean he's doing a perfectly fine job. We have to have that balance. Whether it comes from a third party or the Republican Party, I don't think really matters. I don't see a third party emerging at all, which is why it makes a lot more sense in my view to have a stronger Republican Party to offer that balance moving forward. I think we're on the right track. I think we had a nice election a couple weeks ago, but we got a long way to go.
Maybe an independent Secretary of State would be beneficial.
Dare to dream. All right, we're going to stay around for a couple of hours now to talk about an independent Secretary of State. But before we do that, just a couple of other announcements. First of all, Monday is the next, and if I'm not mistaken, the last political conversation series discussion for the semester that Professor Bob Shrum is going to be leading. That's Monday at 5 p.m. in DKC 300A. And the discussion will be on gender in politics leading into 2016. If you haven't had a chance to go to any of Professor Strum's programs, I'd strongly recommend it. It also counts for extra credit, guys. So, oh yeah, if you're right about it, absolutely. But for intellectual and political reasons, it's a good thing. It's an excellent thing to do too. The last Unruh Institute event of the semester is not on campus, but 1 week from tonight we'll be co-hosting, along with the Kasdan Institute for the Study of Jewish Life, we'll be co-hosting an event for Ambassador Dennis Ross at Temple Sinai on Wilshire Boulevard. And if there are students interested in going, let us know at the Institute, and we'll do our best to help you arrange transportation for that event. And finally, for those of you who were enrolled in Poli-Sci 395 this semester, or for that matter, for those of you who won't, who are not, know that we're already talking to students and internship providers about internship opportunities for spring semester. So as you begin to think through your spring schedule, if interning is something that makes sense for you, either a traditional off-campus internship or on-campus research internships, please visit us at the Unruh Institute. We'll do everything we can to help you get situated. Much more importantly than that, however, even more important than our internship program, just a few thank yous. In just a moment, I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking our panel for leading us through a fascinating discussion. Before I do, please join me, since this is our last on-campus event of the semester at the Unruh Institute. Join me in thanking the entire Unruh Institute team for the tremendous job they do in putting on these programs for all of us week in and week out. Thanks once again to Kirsten Olson, to Tanya Mercado, to Elisa Rangel, to Jody Epstein, and especially to Laura Hill for the work that all of them have done over the course of the semester to make our program Thanks as well to our panelists, to Sam Dorn, to Tara Campbell, to Aaron McClear, and to Ace Smith for a tremendous conversation. Guys, we really, really appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you very much. Thanks to my co-moderator, Yuno Lee, and all his colleagues at the Daily Trojan who are working with us throughout the semester on our programming. We really appreciate it. And finally, thanks to all of you, both students and off-campus guests, for joining us for tonight's program. We hope to see you either next Wednesday for Dennis Ross or certainly for similar programming in the spring. Have a great night.